What if I told you the most British parts of British history aren't the crowns, the castles, or the speeches, but the paperwork, the quiet little forms that decided who ate, who froze, who was respectable, and who deserved to be punished for the crime of being poor? What if the nation that loved order sometimes built it out of public humiliation, legal traps and rules designed to fail you on purpose? Tonight we're going to walk through 100 rare facts you were almost never taught in school because they're awkward, because they're messy, or because they make the heroes look a little less heroic. If you like long, atmospheric history you can half listen to while your brain powers down, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. This is the Britain behind the polished portraits, where the real story is often hiding in the margins. Fact 1. Vagrancy was a flexible word that could mean whatever we need it to mean. The setting is 19th century Britain, where the country is industrializing fast, cities are swelling, and poverty is no longer a private misfortune. It's a public nuisance. The setup sounds simple. Laws against vagrancy are meant to control begging, sleeping rough, and petty disorder, except vagrancy became a net with holes small enough to catch almost anyone inconvenient. Under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, categories like idle and disorderly persons, rogues and vagabond, and incorrigible rogues weren't just colourful phrasing. They were legal labels that allowed arrest with minimal effort. If you were wandering abroad without a good account of yourself, that could be enough. If you looked suspicious in the wrong place, that could be enough. If you were poor in a way that annoyed someone powerful, that could be enough. Historical records and policing practice show how often these laws were used less as moral guidance and more as social control. The consequence was predictable. Poverty became evidence of criminality, and the punishment for having nowhere to go was being forced through a court system that moved like a machine. And speaking of machines designed to process humans, wait until we step inside the workhouse. Fact 2. Workhouses weren't just hard. They were engineered to be less attractive than hunger Victorian. Britain loved a moral story. The setup was that relief existed for the desperate. The workhouse would feed you, house you, and put you to work. The pivot is in the philosophy that shaped it, especially after the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Relief had to be less eligible. In plain language, it had to feel worse than the lowest paid labour outside. Otherwise, officials feared people might choose help over hardship. So the system built discomfort into its design. Strict rules, uniforms, separation of families, monotonous diets, and labour that was often more punishing than productive. This isn't rumour. It's documented in poor law administration, parliamentary debates, and the reports of investigators and reformers who described conditions in clinical detail. And because workhouses were local institutions, the cruelty varied. Some were merely bleak, others were infamous. The consequence was that charity became a deterrent. It didn't just catch the destitute, it warned everyone else. You could almost hear the message, behave, or this is where you end up. Meanwhile, outside those walls, children weren't being protected by innocence. They were being priced by the hour. Fact 3. Child labour wasn't a secret. It was a business model. The setting is industrial Britain, Lancashire mills, Yorkshire factories, mines across the country where time is money and small bodies are useful. The setup is the familiar headline, children worked because families were poor. But the reality is colder. Children worked because employers wanted them. They were cheap, easier to control, and physically suited to tasks adults struggled with, crawling under machinery, squeezing into narrow mine passages, moving quickly through tight spaces. Reform didn't come because the public suddenly developed a conscience. It came because the evidence became too loud to ignore. Medical reports, testimony, newspaper campaigns, and parliamentary inquiries that recorded children describing long hours, injuries, and exhaustion with an eerie matter-of-factness. Factory Acts in the 19th century did limit hours and set age rules, but enforcement was uneven, and loopholes were common. And even when the law changed, the economic logic remained. The system treated childhood as a resource. If you think that was bleak, remember this. Factories weren't the only place children were useful. The state had other uses for them too. Fact 4. Britain transported children across the world and called it care. The setting shifts from smoky streets to ports and ships. The setup sounds benevolent, sending children from overcrowded, impoverished Britain to new lives overseas. In the 19th and 20th centuries, various child migration schemes moved children to places like Canada and Australia. Except many of those children weren't orphans in the clean, storybook sense. Some had living parents, some were in institutions because of poverty, not abandonment, and the oversight could be dangerously thin. Official investigations and later inquiries documented how vulnerable children could be placed in harsh environments, exploited for labour, and, most grimly, abused. The language of rescue made the public feel good. The distance made accountability difficult, and the children, by definition, had the least power to argue with the narrative written about them. The consequence is one of history's recurring pattern. When a policy depends on the public not looking too closely, the public usually obliges. And speaking of policies that required selective attention, let's talk about how Britain regulated morality by policing women's bodies. Fact 5. The state once treated women near naval bases as a public health threat, not people. The setting is mid-19th century Britain, anxious about military readiness and terrified of disease. The setup is practical on paper. Venereal disease among soldiers and sailors was seen as a threat to national strength, so the Contagious Diseases Acts, starting in the 1860s, targeted the presumed source, women suspected of prostitution in certain garrison towns and ports. The pivot is the method. Women could be stopped, identified and forced into invasive medical examination. If they were found to be infected, they could be detained. Meanwhile, the men who actually carried and spread disease were not subject to the same coercion. It was equality, Victorian style, equal blame, unequal power. This is documented in the law itself and in the campaigns against it, especially by women who argued the acts legalized double standards and state violence under a medical mask. The consequence wasn't just personal suffering. It set a precedent that public good could be used to justify stripping rights from a targeted group. But authorities weren't done yet. When it came to controlling the poor, the trick was often to make survival itself look suspicious. Fact 6. Suspicious could mean hungry, and the police could treat it like a crime. The setting is Victorian urban life. Crowded lodging houses, casual labour, street markets and long stretches of unemployment that hit like weather. The setup is that Britain is building professional police forces claiming to bring safety and order, except policing often meant managing visibility, who was allowed to exist comfortably in public space. If you were loitering, sleeping in doorways, asking for food, or simply looking too poor in the wrong district, you could be moved on, arrested or charged under broad public order powers. The point wasn't always to solve crime. It was to keep discomfort out of sight, especially where the respectable classes walked. Contemporary accounts, court records, and social investigation writing show how quickly poverty could be redefined as deviance. The consequence is that the city learned a lesson. Suffering was tolerable, but suffering loudly was not. And speaking of loud suffering, Britain also learned to discipline crowds with a kind of cheerful brutality. Fact 7. Public executions were entertainment, and the state knew exactly what it was doing. The setting is a morning outside a prison or on a scaffold. In an era when hanging was public and crowds were massive, the setup was official. Executions were meant to deter crime, but the pivot is how they actually functioned, as theatre. Vendors sold food, people brought children, spectators joked, drank, flirted, and treated death like a day out, because the state had made it a civic event. Authorities could call it morality, but they understood the deeper value. A public execution was a demonstration of power, a reminder that the state could end you in front of your neighbours and call it justice, Records of crowd behaviour, printed broadsides and contemporary descriptions make clear that deterrence was only part of the story. The consequence is unsettling. A government that punishes in public is also training the public to accept violence as normal. At least hangings ended quickly. Some punishments were designed to stretch time itself. Fact 8. Penal servitude was sold as reform, but it often meant slow erasure. The setting is 19th century prison reform, full of confident men explaining suffering as a lesson. The setup. Britain moves away from some older brutalities and claims to civilize punishment, except the new system often replaced spectacle with isolation. Penal servitude could involve long sentences, hard labor, strict silence, and regimes aimed at breaking habits by breaking spirits. Treadmills, crank machines, and pointless labor weren't always about productivity. They were about discipline. And silent systems turned prisons into places where the mind had nowhere to go, but inward. Official reports and reform debates show how reform language could coexist with practices that produced mental collapse. The consequence was a quieter cruelty. Fewer crowds, fewer stains in the street, more suffering behind walls. Remember this pattern. It repeats everywhere. When a society wants to keep its conscience clean, it moves the violence indoors. And speaking of indoor violence, some of it was happening in institutions meant to heal. Fact 9. Asylums could be warehouses and madness could mean inconvenient. The setting is the Victorian asylum boom, when counties and cities build large institutions for the mentally ill. The setup sounds progressive, a move away from literal chains toward treatment, care, and medical oversight, but the reality was often storage. Once an asylum exists, it fills. People could be committed for conditions we'd now recognize as depression, trauma, epilepsy, dementia, postnatal distress, alcoholism, or simply behavior that families couldn't manage. The line between illness and social control was not always bright, and inside, overcrowding, understaffing, and crude treatments could turn care into containment. This is documented in inspection reports, medical journals of the era, and the testimony of patients and staff. The consequence is that institutions designed to protect could become engines that hid problems rather than solved them. Meanwhile, outside, Britain loved to measure progress, but it also loved to ration it. Fact 10. Clean water was a revolution, and it arrived late for people who needed it most. The setting is 19th century public health, where cholera and typhoid sweep through cities with grim regularity. The setup is that Britain becomes a leader in sanitation. Sewers, pumping stations, waterworks, the engineering triumph story, except access was never evenly distributed. In many places, the poorest districts suffered the longest. Landlords resisted costs, local politics delayed projects, and even when infrastructure existed, the rules of housing meant people could still be packed into unsanitary buildings with shared privies, poor ventilation, and contaminated supplies. Public health reports, mortality statistics, and the work of reformers show the pattern. Disease wasn't just a natural disaster. It followed class lines like a map. The consequence is a hard truth. Many lives were lost not because solutions were unknown, but because solutions were expensive and the wrong people were paying the price. And speaking of price, let's talk about bread, because hunger has always been political. Fact 11. The Corn Laws weren't just about farming, they were about who deserved to eat cheaply. The setting is early 19th century Britain, where industrial towns grow and food prices can decide whether families survive. The setup, the Corn Laws, tariffs and restrictions on imported grain, are defended as protecting British agriculture. But the pivot is the class math. Keeping grain prices high benefited landowners and many rural interests. It also made bread more expensive for urban workers, whose wages didn't magically rise with food costs. Political fights over the Corn Laws weren't abstract economics. They were arguments over whose discomfort counted. Contemporary pamphlets, parliamentary speeches, and the mobilization of groups like the Anti-Corn Law League show how explosive the issue was. When repeal came in 1846, it didn't end hunger. But it did prove something crucial. Policy could be shaped by organized pressure, not just inherited power. If you think that sounds modern, it is. Britain was learning early that the economy is a moral system wearing a numbers costume. Meanwhile, the empire was learning something else. That distance makes cruelty easier. Fact 12. The empire didn't just take land. It rearranged famines, markets, and survival. The setting expands beyond Britain's shores, where imperial administration turns local economies into parts of a global machine. The setup is the familiar claim: railways, trade, and development. But the reality, documented in administrative records and contemporary debate, is that imperial policy could worsen vulnerability, especially when markets, taxes, and export priorities collided with drought, crop failure, or conflict. Famines in parts of British-ruled India, for example, were not simply natural. They were shaped by governance decisions, relief rules, grain movement, revenue demand, and the belief that markets should remain free even while people starve. This is one of those areas where historians argue details, numbers, causes, responsibility, and where the evidence is massive, painful, and fiercely debated. But the broad pattern is difficult to avoid. Policy mattered, and the people making it were often far away from the consequences. And speaking of distance, Britain also used oceans as prisons. Fact 13. Transportation was a punishment, a labour system, and a colonial tool at the same time. The setting is 18th and early 19th century Britain, dealing with crime, overcrowded jails, and a growing empire. The setup, convict transportation to North America and later Australia, is framed as a solution: remove criminals, reduce pressure at home, and populate colonies. But the pivot is that it wasn't just removal, it was extraction. Convicts became labour. They built roads, buildings, farms, infrastructure, often under harsh discipline. Transportation sentences could be brutally disproportionate, a sign for property crimes that today might earn a fine. And once you were shipped, your life became administrative property, assigned, monitored, punished, and used. Official records, ship logs, colonial correspondence, and court documents show how systematic this was. The consequence is that justice also functioned as economic policy. Britain didn't just punish people, it moved them like cargo to build new world. If you think that was the harshest face of British law, wait until you hear how often the law simply pretended not to see violence at home. Fact 14. Domestic violence was often treated as private, which meant permitted. The setting is ordinary British life for centuries, where marriage law and social norms gave men enormous authority inside the home. The setup. Victorian respectability talks endlessly about morality, family, and decency, except the system often protected the image of the home more than the people inside it. Women who were beaten, coerced, or controlled faced legal barriers, social stigma, and economic traps. Divorce was expensive and difficult for much of the 19th century. Police and courts frequently treated domestic violence as a private matter, unless it became spectacular. And private in practice meant not worth the state's trouble. We know this from court cases, social reform writing, and the slow legal changes that eventually recognized women's rights more clearly. The consequence was generational. When violence is normalized as domestic discipline, it teaches everyone to tolerate cruelty as part of order. And speaking of order, Britain didn't just discipline families, it disciplined bodies. Fact 15. The measuring of human beings became a respectable hobby, and it fed racism with numbers. The setting is the 19th century, when science is gaining prestige and the public loves the idea of objective truth. The setup is curiosity. Scholars measure skulls, classify faces, record heights, and build tidy categories for messy human variation. But the pivot is what those measurements were used for. Early anthropology and related movements often treated race and class as biological destiny, dressing prejudice in charts and Latin names. It wasn't fringe. It could sit in respectable institutions, presented as enlightened inquiry. And once a society believes inequality is natural, It stops asking whether it's also chosen. This is documented in the publications, lectures, and institutional records of the era, along with the fierce disputes that eventually exposed how biased the methods were. The consequence wasn't just bad science, it was a moral escape hatch. Oppression could be framed as logic, not violence. And speaking of violence wearing a polite mask, next we need to talk about the British obsession with respectability, because it could be weaponized like a blade. Fact 16. Respectability was a social passport, and it could be revoked over a rumour. The setting is a Britain where reputation is currency, especially if you're poor enough that one accusation can take away your job, your lodging, your friends, and your last thin thread of safety. The setup is the Victorian moral ideal. A respectable life is clean, sober, industrious, and quiet. Except respectability was also a surveillance system. Landlords, employers, neighbours, and local authorities functioned like an informal police force. A whisper about immorality, a child born out of wedlock, a night spent in the wrong house, a public argument. Any of it could brand you. And once you were branded, the system treated your fall as proof that you deserved it. Respectability wasn't simply about behaviour. It was about performing the right version of suffering. Be poor, but not noisy. Be hungry, but grateful. Be desperate, but dignified. Contemporary social investigation writing, charity records, and court reports show how frequently reputational judgment shaped access to help. The consequence is that morality became a gate. It didn't just judge people, it filtered them. And the people most likely to fail the test were the people least able to survive failing. And speaking of filters, Britain developed literal ones too, turning housing into a moral sorting machine. Fact 17. Model dwellings could improve housing and still punish the poor. The setting is late 19th century urban reform, when philanthropists and reformers try to replace slums with better housing. The setup sounds admirable. Model dwellings promise cleaner rooms, better ventilation, safer streets. But the pivot is who was allowed in. Many model housing projects required strict behaviour rules, regular rent, and moral scrutiny. If you were the deserving poor, steady work, tidy family, no drinking, you might qualify. If you were casual labour, chronically ill, recently widowed, or simply chaotic in the way poverty forces people to be, you often didn't. The effect was that the most vulnerable, those who needed safe housing most, could be excluded by design. This is documented in the policies of housing companies, charity debates, and the writings of critics who pointed out the contradiction. Reform that improves the city while leaving the poorest still trapped in the old hellscape. The consequence is a familiar British trick, progress that is real enough to celebrate, but selective enough to preserve hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the streets below, the city was teaching children lessons before school ever got to them. Fact 18. Street children were policed like adults and pitied like animals. The setting is London, Manchester, Liverpool, industrial cities full of street sellers, shoe blacks, match girls, errand runners, and children who slept wherever they could. The setup is the sentimental Victorian image, the ragged child with a brave smile, the moral tale of rescue, except the state often treated street children as a nuisance to be controlled. If you sold goods without a license, begged, slept rough, or loitered, you could be arrested. Reformers might pity you, but the law could still process you. Some institutions offered training, others offered discipline, and the line between help and punishment was thin enough to vanish under pressure. We know this from court records, charity reports, and contemporary journalism that alternated between sympathy and fear. The consequence was a childhood shaped by threat. Even if you avoided prison, you learned early that public space didn't belong to you. And speaking of public space, Britain didn't just regulate who could stand where, it regulated what you could say. Fact 19. Sedition and blasphemy charges could be used to keep the peace by keeping people quiet. The setting is a nation that prides itself on liberty, debate, and parliamentary tradition. The setup is the idea that Britain avoided the worst censorship of some continental states, but the reality is that speech has always had boundaries, especially when it threatened the powerful. Sedition laws, libel laws, and blasphemy prosecutions could target publishers, speakers, and activists. Sometimes it was direct, arrests and trials. Sometimes it was indirect, financial ruin through legal costs, printing restrictions, intimidation. The point wasn't always to secure convictions, it was to teach caution. This is documented in legal records and the history of radical press movements that constantly reinvented themselves to survive. The consequence is that free speech often depended on your status. If you had money and connections, you could test the boundaries. If you didn't, the boundaries tested you. But if you think the state's favourite tool was the courtroom, you haven't met its real obsession. The ledger. Fact 20. Poor relief was a paper empire, and it could turn a life into a file. The setting is the bureaucratic growth of the 19th century. Census forms, parish registers, workhouse admissions, medical inspections, disciplinary logs. The setup is administrative order, knowing who lives where, who needs help, who costs money. Except paperwork can become a cage. Once you entered the poor law system, your life could be recorded in a language that reduced you to categories: able-bodied, infirm, illegitimate, deserted, disorderly. A clerk's decision could shape whether you got indoor relief, outdoor relief, or nothing. A label could follow you. A mistake could harden into truth because it was written down. Historical records show how the poor were documented more aggressively than the comfortable, and how bureaucracy can make suffering appear tidy. The consequence is that the state didn't merely help or punish, it defined you. And speaking of definitions, Britain also defined crime in ways that protected property more fiercely than people. Fact 21. The law was often more angry about a stolen handkerchief than a broken body. The setting is 18th and early 19th century criminal justice, when property crimes could carry shocking penalties. The setup is the story often told: Britain was harsh because it needed deterrence, but the pivot is what it chose to deter. The Bloody Code era saw many offences punishable by death, especially those involving property, theft, burglary, robbery. Meanwhile, violence within the home or workplace could be minimised or excused as discipline, accident, or private matter. This imbalance wasn't accidental. It reflected whose interests the law was built to protect. We know this from statutes, trial records, and the debates that eventually reformed criminal law. The consequence is a sharp moral statement embedded in policy. Property is sacred. People are conditional. If that sounds like a bleak foundation for a modern nation, remember, Britain also built its wealth with a moral loophole the size of the Atlantic. Fact 22. Slavery wasn't a distant sin. Britain profited from it at home in quiet ways. The setting is the 18th century, when British ports are busy, insurance markets are growing, banks are expanding, and sugar is more than a sweetener. It's an economic engine. The setup is the common comfort story. Britain ended the slave trade. Britain abolished slavery. But the reality is that before abolition, British wealth was deeply entangled with enslaved labour, and the profits didn't stay overseas. Money flowed into buildings, estates, political influence, and financial institutions. The moral pivot comes in the aftermath. When slavery was abolished in much of the British Empire in the 1830s, compensation was paid, not to the formerly enslaved, but to slave owners for lost property funded by the state. This is documented in parliamentary records and compensation archives. The consequence is one of history's sharpest ironies. Emancipation was framed as moral triumph, while the financial burden of that triumph was distributed in ways that protected those who had benefited. And speaking of triumph stories, Britain's civilizing mission often hid what it broke. Fact 23. Civilizing often meant rewriting local life to fit British needs. The setting is imperial administration, where governors, officials, missionaries, and trading companies produce reports full of confident language about progress. The setup is the narrative. Britain brings law, order, education, and modernity, except those gifts often arrived with conditions. Local economies could be reshaped to serve export demands. Traditional governance could be undermined or co-opted. Education could be designed to produce clerks for empire rather than empowerment for communities. And when resistance emerged, it could be framed not as political disagreement but as savagery or backwardness. Historians debate specifics across regions because empire was not one policy but many. Yet the pattern is visible in official correspondence, missionary writing, and contemporary critiques. The consequence is that improvement became a justification for control. But if you think control was only overseas, look back home. Britain also colonized its own poor with rules. Fact 24. The deserving poor was an invention that made cruelty feel moral. The setting is charity culture and poor law ideology, where giving is always accompanied by judgment. The setup is a comforting distinction. Some people are poor through misfortune, others through vice. But the pivot is how useful that distinction was. Once you split the poor into deserving and undeserving, you can help some while blaming the rest. You can treat poverty as personal failure instead of economic structure. You can make relief conditional on performance, sobriety, obedience, cleanliness, gratitude, without admitting you're turning survival into a moral audition. This idea is everywhere in Victorian writing. Sermons, newspapers, charity reports, political speeches. The consequence is enduring. It teaches society to ask whether someone earned help rather than whether help is needed. And speaking of charity, sometimes it was designed to humiliate, not heal. Fact 25. Soup kitchens could be built as public warning signs. The setting is hard winters, economic slumps, and urban hunger. The setup is simple. Soup kitchens and relief lines offer food when wages fail and costs rise, except the process could be shaped as deterrents. Long queues in public view, strict oversight, moral lectures, invasive questions. Relief could be a performance of shame. The message was, you may eat, but you will be seen eating. You will be counted, judged, and reminded that this is not your right, only our generosity. Contemporary accounts and charity administration records describe the logic openly. Make relief unpleasant so fewer people ask. The consequence is that hunger becomes not just a physical state, but a social punishment. Food as discipline. If you think that's harsh, remember this. Victorian Britain didn't only discipline hunger, it disciplined noise too. Fact 26. Victorian cities were loud enough to feel like a daily assault. The setting is London's cobblestones, iron-rimmed wheels, hawkers, street musicians, church bells, animals, construction, factory rumble, noise as atmosphere. The setup is romantic, the bustling city alive with commerce. But the pivot is the human cost. Noise isn't just sound, it's stress. It disrupts sleep, frays nerves, shortens tempers, and the people who suffered most were those who couldn't escape it. Crowded housing, street-level rooms, labour schedules that didn't allow recovery. Meanwhile, wealth could buy distance. Quieter streets, thicker walls, greener suburbs. Social commentary from the period describes the exhaustion and irritation of constant sound, and medical writers began to connect urban life to nervous strain. The consequence is subtle but deep. The city itself became a pressure system, squeezing the poor hardest. And speaking of squeezing, Britain's industrial triumph often squeezed bodies into shapes they weren't meant to hold. Fact 27. Industrial injury was common, and accident was often a way to avoid blame. The setting is factories, docks, mines, railways, places where machinery moves faster than human flesh can safely follow. The setup is progress. Britain builds the modern world, engines and steel and speed. But the reality is that safety lagged behind profit. Amputations, crushed limbs, lung disease, deaths. Industrial injury was a feature, not a glitch. Employers could call it accident. Workers could be blamed for carelessness, and legal compensation was limited for much of the period. Over time, reforms emerged, inspection regimes, safety rules, but enforcement and coverage varied. And before modern welfare systems, an injury could mean instant ruin. Evidence comes from hospital records, factory inspection reports, and the campaigns that demanded employer liability. The consequence is that the Industrial Revolution's human cost was paid in bodies, and often recorded as unfortunate noise in the march of progress. Meanwhile, the state was learning to manage crowds in ways that looked like order but felt like threat. Fact 28. Britain used public order as a language to justify force against protest. The setting is political reform movements, workers demanding rights, radicals demanding representation, communities resisting prices, wages, conditions. The setup is the official fear. Crowds can become mobs, but the pivot is how quickly order becomes an excuse for violence. From the use of militia and cavalry at protests to heavy policing of unions and marches, the state often treated organised dissent as a danger to be crushed rather than a message to be heard. Incidents like Peterloo in 1819 became symbols precisely because they revealed a truth the nation disliked. Authority is often most brutal when it feels insecure. The evidence is in eyewitness accounts, official inquiries, newspapers, and the long political memory that turn certain events into warnings. The consequence is that even in a country that celebrated liberty, the right to assemble was never simply granted. It was negotiated under threat. And speaking of negotiation, Britain's elections were once less about voting and more about controlled theatre. Fact 29. Before reform, elections could be bought, drunken, and openly corrupt. The setting is 18th and early 19th century electoral politics, where the franchise is limited and the process is often public. The setup is the myth of Britain's stable constitutional tradition, except representation could be farcical. Rotten boroughs with tiny electorates could send MPs to Parliament. Wealthy patrons could effectively control seats. Voting was not always secret, making intimidation easier. Treating voters with food, drink, and money was common enough to be expected. Reform Acts gradually expanded the franchise and restructured constituencies, but the process was slow and contested. This is documented in parliamentary debates and political histories that show how reform was fought, often by those who benefited from the old system. The consequence is that democracy didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived as a concession, dragged into place by pressure. If you think that's the end of the story, remember, Britain also policed morality through spectacle, especially when it came to women. Fact 30. Fallen women were a social category that let society look away from its own role. The setting is Victorian moral panic, where prostitution is discussed obsessively as both temptation and threat. The setup is public concern. Prostitution is seen as vice, disease, and social decay. But the pivot is how the blame was distributed. The term fallen woman frames a woman's life as a moral collapse, often ignoring why she fell. Poverty, lack of employment, coercion, abuse, lack of legal protection. Meanwhile, the men who purchased sex were often treated as unfortunate participants in a natural male appetite. Reform efforts sometimes helped women, but they could also shame them, confine them, or rescue them into restrictive institutions. This is documented in charity work, social purity campaigns, and the legal double standards of the era. The consequence is another recurring pattern. Society creates a moral scapegoat so it doesn't have to examine the structure that produced the problem. And speaking of structure, Britain's social structure loved to pretend it was natural when it was often enforced. Fact 31. Class wasn't just culture. It was built into law, space, and opportunity. The setting is Britain's long 19th century, where class identity shapes everything from your accent to your life expectancy. The setup is the cultural story. Class is tradition, manners, taste. But the pivot is that class was also a system of access, where you could live, what jobs you could enter, what education you could afford, what courts assumed about you. These weren't neutral outcomes. They were the result of laws, property structures, wages, and social networks. Even merit was often inherited in the form of stability, tutoring, and connections. We know this from social statistics. reform debates, and the writing of people who spent their lives documenting the poor, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes like a scientist studying insects. The consequence is uncomfortable. Britain didn't just have inequality, it had inequality with traditions, which is a fancy way of saying it learned to love the shape of its own injustice. And speaking of injustice with a fancy mask, let's talk about etiquette, because it could be a weapon. Fact 32. Manners were a code, and if you didn't know it, you could be punished without anyone admitting it. The setting is a society obsessed with behaviour, how to speak, how to dress, how to sit, how to eat, how to address a superior. The setup is that manners are harmless, just politeness. But the pivot is that manners also acted as class identification. If you didn't know the code, you revealed yourself. You could be mocked, excluded, refused service, denied a job. And because it's just manners, the punishment looks socially acceptable. No one has to say, "We don't want your kind." They simply notice you used the wrong fork. Victorian etiquette manuals, social commentary, and personal memoirs show how heavily behaviour was policed. The consequence is a quiet form of violence, exclusion disguised as taste. Meanwhile, while the nation obsessed over forks, it ignored other sharp objects, like the industrial chemicals shaping public life. Fact 33. Poisoning was common enough that Victorians developed a whole culture of fear around it. The setting is 19th century domestic life, where food and household goods often contain substances we'd now treat like a hazard site. The setup, the Victorian home, is imagined as safe, except it wasn't always. Arsenic could be found in wallpapers, dyes, and some household products. Adulterated food was a persistent problem. Flour cut with chalk or alum, milk diluted, sweets coloured with dubious pigments. Poisoning wasn't always murder. Sometimes it was the slow result of an unregulated marketplace. This is documented in medical journals, public health reports, and the campaigns that pushed for food and drug regulation. The consequence is that modern Britain was built through trial and error, with the poor most exposed because they bought the cheapest goods and lived in the worst condition. And speaking of cheap goods, let's talk about clothing, because even fabric could be deadly. Fact 34. Some industrial jobs killed workers so reliably they became occupational destinies. The setting is workshops and factories where certain trades came with predictable illness: matchmaking, pottery, mining, textile work. The setup is employment, work that keeps families alive. But the pivot is the brutal exchange rate. Match workers faced phosphorus exposure, leading to horrifying jaw disease in some cases. Miners faced lung disease. Pottery workers inhaled dust and chemicals. Textile workers breathed fibres and endured constant strain. Before robust labour protections, these outcomes could be treated as part of the job. Evidence comes from medical investigations, labour campaigns, and the slow evolution of safety law. The consequence is a grim moral arithmetic. Society accepted certain people being shortened so others could have cheap goods and bright lights. And speaking of bright lights, Britain's street lighting and nightlife also had a shadow economy underneath it. Fact 35. Lodging houses were survival systems, and they could be as dangerous as the street. The setting is urban poverty, where nightly shelter might mean paying a few pennies for a bed or a rope. The setup is that lodging houses offered cheap shelter for those without stable housing, but the reality could be grimly exploitative. Overcrowding, filth, theft, violence, disease. Many lodging houses were places where desperation concentrated. Some had two-penny hangovers, where people could lean on a rope to sleep without paying for a bed, and then be shaken awake in the morning. It wasn't a quirky anecdote. It was an architecture of exhaustion. Contemporary investigations and reform campaigns documented conditions in vivid detail. The consequence is that the city didn't merely contain poverty, it monetized it. If you think that monetizing desperation is a modern sin, Victorian Britain would like a word. Fact 36. Debt could land you in a prison that didn't care whether you could ever pay. The setting is the world of debtors' prisons and legal enforcement, where owing money could become a trap. The setup: debt is a moral failure and prison is a lesson, except prison often made repayment less possible, not more. Debtors could be jailed for sums that now sound absurdly small. Conditions varied and reforms gradually reduced the practice, but the underlying logic was clear. The legal system often treated financial failure as a kind of criminality. This is documented in legal history and the memoirs of people who experienced it. The consequence is cruelly circular. The punishment for being unable to pay was being placed somewhere you couldn't earn. And speaking of earning, Britain's wage system wasn't always paid in money. Fact 37. Some workers were paid in tokens or credit that forced them to buy from the employer. The setting is industrial labour and rural estates, where the lines between employer and local economy could blur into a kind of private kingdom. The setup is employment. You work, you get paid, but the pivot is payment control. In some contexts, workers were paid partly in goods, tokens, or credit redeemable at company shops, systems that could keep wages circulating inside the employer's control. This practice is associated in popular memory with truck systems, and reforms targeted exploitative versions of it. The evidence comes from labour disputes, legislation, and political campaigns that treated fair wages as a civic issue. The consequence is that free labour could still be economically captive. Meanwhile, while workers were trapped by credits, women were trapped by law. Fact 38. For a long time, married women's property wasn't really theirs. The setting is British marriage law, where a woman's legal identity could be absorbed into her husband's under doctrines like coverture. The setup is the romantic ideal. Marriage is partnership, but the pivot is the legal reality. Marriage could be annexation. Historically, a married woman's ability to own property, sign contracts, or control earnings was severely limited. Reforms like the Married Women's Property Acts in the late 19th century altered this, but before then, women could be financially erased by the act of marrying. This is documented in legal history and the campaigning that demanded change. The consequence is structural dependence. When law makes autonomy difficult, it makes escape from abuse and poverty even harder. And speaking of escape, sometimes the only escape offered to the poor was to join the armed forces. Fact 39. The army could be a way out of hunger, which meant it could also be a system that fed on it. The setting is recruitment in 18th and 19th century Britain, where the military is both a national pride and a human drain. The setup: service offers pay, food, and identity, but the pivot is who it recruited most easily. When wages were low and work was unstable, enlistment could become less a choice and more a pressured option. Recruitment methods varied. Sometimes persuasion, sometimes coercion in earlier eras through impressment in naval context, and always the underlying reality that poverty supplies bodies. Records, memoirs, and military history show how service could be both opportunity and exploitation. The consequence is a hard pattern. States often rely on economic vulnerability to fill their ranks. And speaking of relying on vulnerability, Britain relied on it in its charities too, especially when it came to children. Fact 40. Rescue institutions for children could sometimes feel like prisons with hymn books. The setting is philanthropic homes, industrial schools, reformatories, and religious rescue missions. The setup: save children from vice and poverty, teach them skills, build moral character. But the pivot is discipline. Rules could be strict, punishments harsh, emotional warmth scarce. Some institutions did genuine good. Others acted as pipelines into labour, service, or migration schemes. And because these places were wrapped in moral rhetoric, criticism could be dismissed as ingratitude. Evidence comes from inspection reports, scandals when abuse surfaced, and later historical studies. The consequence is again that institutional power tends to protect itself, especially when it can claim righteousness. If you think that was the darkest thing hiding behind virtue, remember, Britain also built moral stories around alcohol, and those stories often targeted the poor more than the system. Fact 41. Temperance movements sometimes blamed drink for poverty. instead of poverty for drink. The setting is 19th century Britain, where wages can be irregular, housing can be damp enough to qualify as weather, and the workday can chew through your body like a slow machine. The setup is the temperance message. Alcohol is the enemy. Drink is the root of ruin. Sobriety is salvation. Except temperance could become a convenient story for people who preferred simple villains. It's easier to say stop drinking than to say stop paying starvation wages. It's easier to blame gin than to blame a labour market built on insecurity. And when reformers aimed their outrage mainly at the working poor, while politely ignoring the drinking habits of the wealthy, they weren't just promoting health, they were promoting obedience. This isn't to romanticize alcohol. Victorian drinking could be destructive, but the social consequence of the temperance framing was sharp. It redefined structural poverty as personal weakness, and it handed employers and lawmakers a moral excuse to keep conditions unchanged. And speaking of conditions, Britain built an entire welfare system around the idea that help should hurt. Fact 42. The workhouse test was a policy that turned desperation into a threat. The setting is the poor law world after 1834, where relief is redesigned to discourage reliance on it. The setup sounds administratively neat. If you need help, you go to the workhouse, where your needs will be met under supervision. But the pivot is what the test actually was. If relief is only available in a place that separates families, enforces uniforms, restricts movement and imposes monotonous diets and labour, then the system isn't just assessing need. It's daring you to endure humiliation. The workhouse becomes a warning sign posted at the edge of society. This is what happens when you fall. Official records and contemporary arguments show the logic wasn't hidden. The deterrent was the point. The consequence was that people would avoid seeking help until they were already collapsing, because the help came with a price paid in dignity. Meanwhile, outside the workhouse walls, the poor built their own survival networks that could be surprisingly exclusionary. Fact 43. Friendly societies and mutual aid could save lives, but they also policed respectability. The setting is working-class Britain before modern welfare, where illness or injury can mean instant catastrophe. The setup is mutual aid. Friendly societies, burial clubs and benefit associations collect contributions and provide support, except even solidarity can come with gatekeeping. Many societies required regular payments and good character. If you missed contributions because you were unemployed, you might be dropped precisely when you needed help. If you were seen as immoral, drinking, disorderly, pregnant outside marriage, you could be excluded. The structure often mirrored the wider society. Help was offered, but only to those who performed the right kind of deservingness. This is documented in the rules societies wrote for themselves and in the broader culture of moral judgment. The consequence is complicated. Mutual aid was real and valuable, but it could also reproduce the same social sorting that made state help so punishing. And speaking of sorting, Britain literally sorted the poor by where they were allowed to belong. Fact 44. The poor law. Settlement system could get you removed like a piece of unwanted furniture. The setting is parish-based welfare, where responsibility for poor relief is local and money is jealously guarded. The setup is administrative fairness. Each parish supports its own poor, and rules determine where that responsibility lies. But the pivot is what happens when you're poor and mobile. If you moved to find work and then fell into need, authorities could remove you back to the parish deemed responsible for you. In practice, this meant people could be pushed around the country like a problem being passed along. The logic wasn't compassion. It was cost control. Settlement rules changed over time and varied in practice, but the underlying consequence remained. Mobility, a thing the economy demanded, could become a trap for the vulnerable. You could chase wages and be punished for chasing them. And speaking of punishment disguised as policy, children were often the easiest targets for solutions. Fact 45. Parish apprentices could be sent far from home and worked hard enough to break them. The setting is an era when orphaned or impoverished children can be bound out as apprentices. The setup sounds respectable. Apprenticeships provide training, discipline, and a future. Except parish apprenticeships could be closer to a labour pipeline than an education. Children from workhouses or poor families could be sent to factories or trades far from home, with little oversight once the contract was signed. Some masters were decent. Others treated children as cheap, controllable workers who couldn't easily run away. When scandals surfaced, they tended to reveal the same pattern. The system claimed to be protective while offering children up to economic demand. The evidence lives in contracts, inquiries, and reform campaigns that tried to limit abuse. The consequence is chilling. Childhood becomes an administrative resource, managed for the convenience of adults. If you think that was harsh, wait until you hear what happened to children small enough to fit where adults couldn't. Fact 46. Chimney sweeping relied on children because the job was built around child-sized suffering. The setting is urban Britain with narrow chimneys and constant coal smoke. The setup is a trade necessity. Chimneys must be cleaned to prevent fires and keep homes functional. But the pivot is the human method. For a long time, the work relied on boys, sometimes very young, forced or pressured into climbing inside tight, filthy, dangerous chimneys. They scraped soot, inhaled smoke, risked suffocation, burns and falls. Reform came slowly, fought by those who insisted the system couldn't work otherwise, because conveniently the system was designed around exploitability. Contemporary accounts and legislative battles show how long it took for law to catch up with basic moral sense. The consequence is one of Britain's recurring truth. When an economy depends on cruelty, it will insist cruelty is necessary until it is finally forced to change. And speaking of forcing change, sometimes the dead forced it because even corpses weren't safe. Fact 47. Resurrection men stole bodies because medical training demanded cadavers and the law didn't provide them. The setting is early 19th century medical education, when anatomy is advancing and surgical training needs real bodies. The setup is respectable science. Doctors must learn the human body to save lives, except the supply problem created a market. Legal sources of cadavers were limited, often tied to executed criminals. Demand grew and so did body snatching. Graves, especially those of the poor, could be robbed because families lacked money for guards, iron cages or secure burial. It became a grim economy. The dead were stolen to train the living. This isn't folklore. It's documented in criminal cases, public outrage, and the legislative response that eventually changed the rules around dissection. The consequence is darkly logical. When society refuses to confront how science is funded, the poor end up paying with their bodies, sometimes after death. And speaking of dissection, Britain once treated it as an extra punishment, as if death wasn't enough. Fact 48. Dissection was used as a moral warning. We will not only kill you, we will unmake you. The setting is the era when the state wants punishment to terrify. The setup is execution. You die for your crime, and justice is done. But the pivot is what happened after. For a time, dissection could be formally attached to the punishment of certain criminals. The message was clear and vicious. Your body will not rest. Your remains will be taken apart in public or semi-public, turned into instruction, denied the dignity of ordinary burial. In a deeply religious society, this mattered, not only emotionally but spiritually for many people who feared what it meant for the afterlife. Records and legal history show how dissection served as a symbolic extension of state power. The consequence was that the poor, who were most likely to be executed for property crimes, were also more likely to be used as anatomical material. At least that ended with a kind of burial. For many poor people, even burial was managed like waste disposal. Fact 49. Pauper funerals could be fast, cheap, and deliberately without dignity. The setting is Britain before modern social safety nets, where dying poor often meant being buried poor. The setup. Local authorities provide burial when families can't. But the pivot is the treatment. Pauper funerals could involve mass graves, minimal ceremony, Cheap coffins, hurried processes, and rules designed to keep costs down. Sometimes that meant separating the dead from family rituals. Sometimes it meant burying people in ways that reinforced their status even after life ended. This is documented in local records and the broader history of burial practices and public health. The consequence is a final lesson taught to the poor. Even your death will be administered at the lowest possible cost, and the city will move on quickly. And speaking of public health, Britain's relationship with disease was shaped as much by fear of the poor as by germ. Fact 50. Epidemics were often framed as a moral problem before they were treated as an engineering problem. The setting is cholera and other outbreaks sweeping through cramped neighbourhoods. The setup is panic. People want explanations and officials want control. But the pivot is the story society told itself. Before germ theory became widely accepted, disease was often blamed on filth, bad air, moral weakness, and personal habits, ideas that conveniently aligned with existing prejudice against the poor. Even when observers noticed that wealthier districts suffered less, the conclusion was not always fix housing and water. Sometimes it was the poor are dirty, as if poverty were a personality trait. Public health reformers fought to shift the focus towards sanitation, water supply, sewer systems, housing, because evidence piled up in maps, mortality statistics, and investigation. The consequence is that science had to battle not only ignorance, but a moral narrative that protected inequality. And speaking of moral narratives, vaccination became one of the most bitterly contested, precisely because it sat where the body meets the state. Fact 51. Smallpox vaccination became a flashpoint for freedom, fear, and class distrust. The setting is 19th century Britain, where smallpox is a killer, and vaccination is a powerful tool. The setup is straightforward. Vaccination saves lives, so the state encourages it, and eventually compels it in certain forms. But the pivot is how compulsion lands when trust is already broken. For people who experienced the state mainly as the workhouse, the police, and the inspector, mandatory could feel like threat. Concerns ranged from safety fears to religious objections to resentment of coercion. Resistance movements formed, and enforcement could become another arena where the poor felt targeted. Historical records show vaccination debates were intense and public, and the laws were adjusted over time in response. The consequence is a lesson Britain learned repeatedly. Public health works best when the public believes you're trying to help them, not manage them. Meanwhile, while Britain argued about needles, it was also building new kinds of speed that killed in new ways. Fact 52. Railway deaths and injuries created a modern fear. You could be crushed by progress. The setting is the railway age, where trains shrink distance and expand commerce. The setup is national pride, iron roads, engineering triumph, modern Britain on the move. But the pivot is the casualty list. Early rail travel carried real risk. Collisions, derailments, workplace deaths on the tracks, passengers injured in accidents that the public struggled to understand because the scale of force was new. Even the psychological aftermath became a topic, with debates about railway spine and trauma long before modern language for it settled. This is documented in accident reports, court cases, and medical discussion. The consequence is that progress didn't just change the economy, it changed what people feared. Suddenly, death could arrive not as war or disease, but as machinery, fast, impersonal, and indifferent. And speaking of indifference, industrial Britain also poisoned its own air with the casual confidence of a nation that thought smoke looked like success. Fact 53. Pollution was so normal that people learned to live inside it, like fish in water. The setting is coal-burning cities where chimneys dominate the skyline and soot settles like weather. The setup is prosperity, factories run, homes are heated, industry thrives. But the pivot is the slow damage: smog, soot, respiratory illness, filthy streets, contaminated rivers. Pollution was a daily companion. The wealthy could escape to cleaner districts or countryside homes. The poor lived closer to factories, closer to smoke, closer to waste. And because the harm was gradual, It was easy for society to treat it as background rather than crisis. Public health observers and reformers documented the link between air quality and disease, but economic priorities often won. The consequence is grimly familiar. When harm is distributed unequally and quietly, it can last for generations before it becomes politically urgent. If you think politically urgent is a slow British art form, wait until you hear about the Thames, because the river became a literal argument you couldn't breathe through. Fact 54. The Thames became a public health disaster before it became an engineering project. The setting is London at peak growth, where sewage, industrial waste, and human density collide. The setup is that the city's systems are coping, in the way a person with a fever insists they're fine. But the pivot is the smell and the sickness. For years, waste flowed into the river that also provided water, directly or indirectly. Disease outbreaks and filthy conditions pushed reformers to demand action. The infamous moment, when the stench became unbearable even for Parliament, helped force investment and political will. This is documented in public health history and the records of sanitation projects. The consequence is that London's transformation wasn't only a story of enlightened governance. It was also a story of being forced to fix what everyone already knew was deadly. And speaking of deadly environments, some people survived by working in the city's waste, turning rubbish into a livelihood. Fact 55. The poor built a shadow economy around other people's trash. The setting is streets, markets, dumps, riversides, places where discarded things still hold value. The setup is deprivation. People without stable work find ways to survive. But the pivot is how systematic this became. Rag pickers, bone collectors, scavengers, and other informal workers recovered materials that could be sold. Cloth for paper making, bones for industry, metal for reuse. It was recycling before it was a virtue, driven not by environmental idealism, but by hunger. Contemporary observers wrote about these livelihoods with a mix of fascination and disgust, as if poverty were a spectacle. The consequence is that the city depended on invisible labour, while shaming the people doing it. Britain loved cleanliness, but it often outsourced the filth. And speaking of outsourcing, when people left prison, the state didn't simply release them, it often marked them. Fact 56. Ticket of leave and early parole systems could function like a leash. The setting is 19th century penal reform, where officials claim they can manage crime by supervising release. The setup sounds reasonable. Instead of endless imprisonment, you release people under conditions and monitor behaviour. But the pivot is how those conditions could trap the poor. If you needed to find work and housing quickly, without savings, without references, with a stigma attached, then strict rules could become tripwires. Miss a reporting requirement, be found in the wrong place, associate with the wrong people, and you could be returned to custody. Surveillance became its own form of punishment, especially for those with few legal ways to stabilize their lives. Records of policing and penal administration show how supervision could slide into harassment. The consequence is a system that claims to encourage reform while making normal life harder to achieve. Meanwhile, Britain was also inventing new ways to identify people, because nothing says modern like turning humans into data. Fact 57. Police photography and record keeping turn suspicion into a permanent file. The setting is the rise of modern policing, where forces professionalize and embrace technology. The setup is efficiency. Keep records, identify repeat offenders, reduce crime. But the pivot is permanence. Once the police began collecting photographs, descriptions, addresses, and associations, a person could become a type in a system's eyes. And systems love types because types simplify judgment. If you were labelled as a known troublemaker, that identity could follow you even when you were trying to change. This is documented in the history of police methods and the expanding bureaucracy of law enforcement. The consequence is subtle and powerful. When the state writes a story about you, it can become harder to write a different one yourself. And speaking of writing stories about bodies, Britain became increasingly interested in measuring the body as proof. Fact 58. Early identification methods treated the human body like a walking passport. The setting is late 19th century criminology, where officials want certainty in a world of mobility. The setup. Names can be faked, papers can be forged, but bodies are unique. So measure the body. But the pivot is the ideology riding shotgun. Systems like anthropometric measurement and later fingerprinting emerged as practical tools, but they also reinforced the idea that criminality could be read in flesh. The appeal wasn't only accuracy, it was the fantasy that society could categorize people into predictable outcomes, as if a ruler and an ink pad could replace understanding. The historical evidence is in policing archives, administrative practice, and the cultural fascination with scientific certainty. The consequence is that identity becomes something the state owns and interprets. If you think that sounds clinical, remember that Britain's political system used to be openly unclinical because voting wasn't private. Fact 59. Public voting made intimidation easy and democracy very negotiable. The setting is Britain before the secret ballot is fully established, where votes can be known, watched, and pressured. The setup is the ideal: representation, civic duty, the voice of the people. But the pivot is the reality of power. When votes are public, employers can threaten workers, landlords can threaten tenants, local elites can reward loyalty and punish dissent. Even without direct violence, the social pressure can be enough. The ballot becomes not a private expression, but a performance under observation. Parliamentary debates and reform campaigns show how secret voting became a hard-fought demand, not a natural feature of British liberty. The consequence is again a pattern. Rights expand when people organise loudly enough that the cost of refusal rises. Meanwhile, while Britain slowly widened political power at home, it maintained a very different style of power at sea, sometimes by grabbing men off the street. Fact 60. Impressment made the Navy a kind of legal kidnapping machine. The setting is Britain's naval wars and maritime empire, when ships need crews and the state wants results. The setup is national survival. The Navy is essential, so manpower must be found. But the pivot is the method. Impressment, press gangs taking men into naval service, was a reality in certain periods, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The practice was contested, resented and uneven, often falling hardest on working men who lacked protection or influence. It turned the streets and docks into recruitment zones where citizen could become resource with alarming speed. This is documented in legal history, memoirs, and the political conflict around the practice. The consequence is that Britain's maritime power, so often celebrated, was sometimes built with coercion that felt indistinguishable from outright seizure. And speaking of coercion, when sailors resisted, discipline could be spectacular. Fact 61. Naval punishment could be designed to make an example that lasted longer than the wound. The setting is the wooden walls of Britain's fleet, where hierarchy is sharp and rebellion is existential fear. The setup is order at sea. Discipline is necessary because mistakes can kill ships. But the pivot is what discipline looked like. Harsh punishments, flogging, confinement, public degradation were used to maintain control. The point wasn't only correction. It was theatre for the crew, a reminder that authority lives in the body. Mutinies like those at Spithead and the Nore in 1797 show how tense these systems could become, with sailors demanding fairer conditions while the state feared collapse. Historical accounts and official responses show both sides, real grievances and real panic. The consequence is that even national defence can depend on internal violence to keep the machine running. And speaking of machines, empire had its own machinery, and one of its most profitable gears was a trade Britain preferred to describe as complicated. Fact 62. Britain profited from opium while preaching moral order. The setting is 19th century global trade and imperial administration, where revenues, monopolies, and commercial power mix with moral rhetoric. The setup is Britain's self-image, a nation of law, civilization and discipline. But the pivot is what revenue can persuade a state to tolerate. The opium trade, particularly connected to imperial interests in Asia, became a major moral controversy. The uncomfortable truth is that economic incentives and administrative structures could align to sustain a trade that caused social harm, even while British discourse at home celebrated moral reform and self-control. This is documented in political debate, commercial records, and the long historical argument over responsibility and motive. The consequence is not just hypocrisy, it's a demonstration of something Britain did repeatedly: morality at home, exploitation where the money was made. And speaking of exploitation, after slavery was abolished, labour demand didn't vanish. It simply found a new name. Fact 63. After abolition, indenture could function like a new shape of unfreedom. The setting is the 19th century empire after the abolition of slavery in many territories. The setup is the official line: slavery is over and free labour will replace it. But the pivot is the labour reality. Indentured labour systems recruited workers, often from India and elsewhere, on contracts that promised wages and passage. In practice, conditions could be harsh, coercion could be subtle or direct, and mobility could be restricted by debt, distance, and legal constraints. The experiences varied across regions and employers, and historians debate how best to frame the system. But the power imbalance was real. Administrative correspondence, testimonies, and later inquiries reveal how easily contract can become a cage when one side controls transport, law, and enforcement. The consequence is that abolition did not automatically end exploitation, it reorganized it. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the empire wasn't only managed through policy, it was performed, sometimes by putting human beings on display. Fact 64. Imperial exhibitions could turn colonized people into entertainment for the British public. The setting is the age of exhibitions and world fairs, where Britain celebrates industry, empire, and modernity with grand displays. The setup is education and wonder. The public can see the world, learn about cultures, and admire the reach of the empire. But the pivot is the human cost of that spectacle. In some exhibitions and displays, colonized people were presented in staged villages or performances that reinforced stereotypes of primitiveness and difference. Even when framed as anthropological or educational, the underlying message was often hierarchy. Look at them. Look at us and notice who is supposedly advanced. This is documented in exhibition records, contemporary commentary, and later critique. The consequence is psychological empire. Conquest doesn't only happen through land and law, it happens through story, through teaching the public to see dominance as natural. And speaking of stories, Britain's favourite story about itself is that it's uniquely fair. So here's a rare fact. Fairness often depended on whether you were the right kind of person in the right kind of court. Fact 65. Justice could vary wildly by class, local power, and who was doing the judging. The setting is courts that range from local magistrates to higher trials in a society where social status still carries weight like a physical object. The setup is the ideal. British justice is impartial, evidence-based, and consistent, but the pivot is the human reality. Magistrates were often local elites. Juries could be shaped by property qualifications in earlier periods. Legal representation depended on money. The same act, fighting, theft, disorder, could be interpreted differently depending on who you were, who you knew, and whether the court saw you as redeemable or disposable. This is visible in court records, memoirs, and the long reform history that tried, gradually, to standardize and professionalize the system. The consequence is a kind of everyday lottery. The law might be the law, but its application could still feel like a social judgment wearing legal clothing. And speaking of clothing, next we need to talk about uniforms, because once Britain could put you in one, it could also decide what you were. Fact 66. Uniforms and institutional clothing were used to erase identity as much as to provide order. The setting is the workhouse, the prison, the asylum, the reformatory, Britain's great interior empire of institutions. The setup is practical. Uniforms are hygienic, cheap and easy to manage, but the pivot is psychological. Uniforms don't just clothe a body, they declare what that body is allowed to be. In a workhouse uniform, you are not Mrs. So-and-so with a history and a voice. You are an inmate. In prison clothing, you are a number. In an asylum, you are a patient, which can sometimes mean a person whose words are automatically suspect. Contemporary accounts and institutional records show how clothing policies worked alongside rules, silence, routines, separation to reshape identity. The consequence is that when you enter an institution, you can be reduced to a category so completely that even your reflection looks like property of the system. And speaking of the system owning people, Britain also built rules about children that treated them less like citizens and more like raw material. Fact 67. Industrial schools could be a factory for obedience, not education. The setting is the 19th century fear of juvenile delinquency, where politicians and reformers talk about dangerous children in crowded cities. The setup is rescue. Take children off the streets, teach them discipline and skills, prevent crime. But the pivot is what prevention often meant. Industrial schools could remove children from their communities for behaviours tied to poverty, vagrancy, truancy, petty theft, being neglected. The state framed this as moral intervention. For the children, it could be confinement. Education existed, but so did regimented labour and strict control, with the underlying aim of producing orderly workers. Evidence comes from legislation, inspection reports, and the lived outcomes traced by historians. The consequence is that poverty became grounds for state takeover of childhood. Britain didn't only punish crime, it preemptively punished the conditions that looked like crime might happen. And speaking of preemption, Britain's approach to sexuality and identity also relied on policing what might happen. Fact 68. Moral panics created laws that were designed to be vague on purpose. The setting is late 19th century anxiety about sexuality and public decency. The setup is the claim of protecting society. Laws are needed to prevent corruption, scandal, and disorder. But the pivot is the deliberate flexibility. Some legislation was written broadly enough that it could be used against people not for what they did in public, but for who they were, what they were suspected of, and what society feared. Vagueness is useful. It lets authorities decide where the line is after the fact. This is visible in legal history, court cases, and the culture of scandal that made private lives public weapons. The consequence is predictable. When laws are designed to be elastic, they stretch around the vulnerable and snap against them hardest. Meanwhile, Britain's moral policing wasn't only about sex, it was also about reproduction, because nothing terrified authority like women making decisions. Fact 69. Control over birth and motherhood was a political issue, long before people admitted it was the setting as a Britain where large families are common, wages are unstable and maternal death is not rare. The setup is silence. Respectable society avoids openly discussing contraception, abortion or reproductive choices. But the pivot is reality. People still made choices. Women used whatever knowledge and methods they could access, often whispered through networks. Campaigns for birth control emerged, fiercely contested. The law treated abortion harshly, and clandestine practices could be deadly. Meanwhile, the social judgment fell heavily on women even though men were equal participants in the causes of pregnancy. Evidence comes from legal cases, medical writing, reform movements, and the gradual evolution of public discourse. The consequence is a long shadow. When the state and society control reproduction through stigma and punishment, they shape family life as a political instrument. And speaking of political instruments, Britain also loved to claim its army and navy were heroic machines of honour. The truth is they were also machines of discipline and sometimes desperation. Fact 70. Desertion was often a crime of survival, not cowardice. The setting is military life in the 18th and 19th century. harsh conditions, low pay, brutal discipline, and long service. The setup is the moral language. Desertion is betrayal. But the pivot is why people deserted. Some fled unbearable punishment. Some left because family at home was starving. Some were recruited under pressure and never truly consented. Some simply couldn't endure. Desertion rates and enforcement varied by war and era, but the system's response could be severe, because the military depends on making examples. Records of courts-martial and military discipline reveal a world where personal crisis collided with institutional rigidity. The consequence is that national glory often rests on individual misery, quietly endured. If you think that's grim, remember, Britain also produced glory narratives about exploration that often ignored the violence of discovery. Fact 71. Exploration could be a claim of ownership, written in the language of adventure. The setting is the age of exploration, mapping, and imperial expansion. The setup is romance. Brave men travel into the unknown, endure hardship, and bring knowledge home. But the pivot is the power embedded in the act. To discover a place already inhabited is to claim authority over it. Maps aren't neutral. Names aren't neutral. When explorers planted flags, negotiated treaties under unequal power, or opened routes for trade and conquest, they weren't just collecting fact, they were laying groundwork for control. This is documented in exploration accounts, colonial administration, and the way British narratives framed these acts as heroic rather than invasive. The consequence is that adventure stories can function as propaganda, training the public to see domination as curiosity. And speaking of propaganda, Britain's national memory often polished war into heroism and forgot the administrative brutality required to sustain it. Fact 72. War created bureaucracies that could be as cruel as the battles. The setting is Britain at war, where supply chains, recruitment, medicine, and logistics expand. The setup is necessity. War requires organization, but the pivot is that bureaucracies can treat people as units. Whether it's rationing, conscription, medical triage, or the handling of refugees and displaced people in imperial context, paperwork becomes a weapon when it prioritizes efficiency over humanity. Decisions made in offices can determine who lives, who starves, who gets treatment, who is sent somewhere dangerous. Historical records show how war administration can become a moral fog. Responsibility is scattered across committees, forms, and procedure. The consequence is a kind of cruelty without a face, harm that happens because the system says it must. Meanwhile, back in peacetime, Britain's economy created its own moral fog around labour, especially women's labour. Fact 73. Women's work was essential, underpaid, and often treated as if it didn't count. The setting is domestic service, textile work, factory labour, laundry, cleaning, caregiving, the invisible scaffolding of daily life. The setup is the cultural narrative. Men are breadwinners, women are dependents. But the pivot is the numbers. Women worked constantly. Domestic service alone employed vast numbers of women in Victorian Britain. Factory work relied on women and girls, yet wages were often lower than men's, and the work could be framed as supplemental even when it was essential. And because the ideology insisted women's place was the home, women's labour could be devalued even when it sustained the whole social order. This is documented in labour statistics, social reform writing, and the economic history of households. The consequence is a society that ran on women's work while refusing to grant it equal status or security. And speaking of security, Britain's housing system could turn illness into a life sentence. Fact 74. Slum clearance could destroy communities and still fail to house the people displaced. The setting is urban renewal efforts in the 19th and 20th century. The setup is public health and improvement. Clear overcrowded slums, build better housing, reduce disease. But the pivot is displacement. Clearing housing doesn't automatically build affordable alternatives. Often, clearance destroyed dense communities and pushed the poorest into other crowded areas. or into housing that wasn't available at their price point. Improvement could benefit the city's image and property values, while leaving the former residents still trapped in insecurity. Municipal records and social histories show how often the promise of replacement lagged behind demolition. The consequence is that reform can become another form of violence when it prioritizes space over people. If you think that's a modern-sounding policy failure, that's because it is. History repeats when incentives don't change. And speaking of incentives, Britain's global power depended on finance, and finance developed its own forms of cruelty. Fact 75. Insurance and financial markets profited from human risk, including risk created by empire. The setting is London's financial rise, insurance markets, trade financing, shipping investment. The setup is neutral economics. Markets spread risk, enable commerce, support prosperity. But the pivot is what risk included. Shipping risk included human cargo in the era of slavery. Colonial trade included violence risk. War risk became a business opportunity. Even in domestic contexts, the poor often paid more for basic services because they had less stability. Finance doesn't invent cruelty, but it can monetize it with remarkable efficiency. Evidence exists in the history of insurance, trade records, and the economic structures that tied British prosperity to global extraction. The consequence is uncomfortable. A society can build respectable wealth through systems that treat suffering as a line item. And speaking of line items, Britain's census and statistics weren't just information. They were tools of control. Fact 76. Counting people can be a form of power, especially when it defines who matters. The setting is the growth of state knowledge, censuses, registries, surveys, mapping. The setup is administrative improvement. The state needs data to plan services, understand population, and manage resources. But the pivot is how data shapes reality. What you count becomes what you see. What you don't count becomes invisible. Categories define identity, sometimes crudely. Statistics can justify policy by making it appear inevitable. And when the state uses numbers to decide where to invest, who to police, and how to classify communities, counting becomes governance. This is documented in the history of bureaucracy and social policy. The consequence is subtle. People become populations, and populations become targets for intervention, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful. Meanwhile, the intervention Britain loved most was punishment disguised as morality, which brings us to schooling. Fact 77. Education was expanded as a civic good, but also as a tool to produce obedient workers. The setting is the rise of compulsory education, where Britain begins to take children into formal schooling more systematically. The setup is uplifting. Education improves lives, spreads literacy, builds opportunity. But the pivot is what kind of education was prioritized. Schooling often emphasized discipline, punctuality, hierarchy, and basic skills suited to industrial labor. It was not only about awakening minds, it was also about shaping behavior. The classroom became a training ground for the factory. Sit still, follow orders, respect authority, accept routine. Education history shows the tension between genuine uplift and social control. The consequence is that even a good thing can have an edge. Schooling could liberate, but it could also domesticate rebellion. And speaking of rebellion, Britain's labour movements were treated as threats long before they were celebrated as part of democracy. Fact 78. Early trade unionism was criminalised and suppressed, even when it was about basic survival. The setting is industrial labour organising in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The setup is collective bargaining. Workers want fair wages, safer conditions, shorter hours. But the pivot is the state's reaction. For periods, combinations of workers were restricted or outlawed. Even when legal frameworks changed, unions could be policed, infiltrated, prosecuted, and blamed for unrest. Employers and authorities feared collective power because it threatened the economic order. This is documented in labour law history and the stories of organisers who faced arrest or transport. The consequence is that rights we now treat as normal were once framed as dangerous conspiracies. If you think that's dramatic, remember Britain didn't only suppress labour, it sometimes used hunger as a weapon against it. Fact 79. Strikes often meant starvation, and employers knew it. The setting is a strike. Workers stop work to demand change. The setup is the simple moral logic. If work is unfair, withhold labour. But the pivot is the imbalance of resources. Employers often had reserves, networks, and sometimes state support. Workers had families who needed food tonight. Strike-breaking, blacklists, and evictions could turn a strike into a slow-motion siege. Communities sometimes rallied with mutual aid, but the pressure could be brutal. Evidence comes from strike histories and the development of union funds and solidarity networks designed precisely to survive these battles. The consequence is that labour rights were purchased with suffering, not speeches. And speaking of suffering, some of Britain's most intense cruelty was hidden inside a word that sounds mild: discipline. Fact 80. Discipline was often a polite word for pain, whether in schools, workhouses, prisons, or homes. The setting is an era where obedience is prized and authority is rarely questioned. The setup is the claim. Discipline builds character, but the pivot is what discipline often physically meant: corporal punishment in schools, harsh regimes in institutions, beatings in homes treated as private correction. Violence was normalized as instruction, and because it was framed as for your own good, victims could be told they deserved it, which is one of the most efficient ways to make cruelty self-sustaining. This is documented in memoirs, reform campaigns, and the slow legal and cultural shifts that reduced some practices. The consequence is generational trauma wrapped in moral language. And speaking of moral language, Britain loved to talk about charity, but charity could be a form of control as precise as any law. Fact 81. Charity givers could demand obedience and gratitude as a price of help. The setting is a Britain proud of philanthropy. Wealthy donors, church collections, moral reform societies, missions for the poor. The setup is comforting, the rich help the unfortunate, and the nation shows its heart. But the pivot is the transaction hidden inside the help. Charity often came with conditions, behavioural rules, moral scrutiny, and the expectation of visible gratitude. Some organisations required attendance at sermons, lifestyle changes, and demonstrations of good character. If you were angry about your situation, you risked being labelled ungrateful. If you didn't perform humility, help could be withdrawn. This is visible in charity reports, reform literature, and the testimonies of the poor recorded by investigators. The consequence is that aid became a lever. It could lift you, but it could also keep your head down. In a society without universal welfare, charity could function like a private government. And speaking of private government, landlords often ran their own little empires, and tenants lived inside their rules. Fact 82. Housing power was so strong that eviction could function like an instant sentence. The setting is rented rooms, cramped terraces, lodging houses, tied cottages, places where most people lived without owning. The setup is normal. Rent is exchanged for shelter. But the pivot is insecurity. If you couldn't pay, if you argued, if you were seen as troublesome, eviction could happen fast. And eviction wasn't just losing a roof. It meant losing stability, losing proximity to work, losing community ties, and often sliding into worse housing, the street or the workhouse. Historical housing records, reform campaigns, and social investigation writing show how precarious life could be for those who lived paycheck to paycheck. The consequence is that landlords held a kind of policing power, shaping behaviour through fear. Meanwhile, the state had another tool for shaping behaviour: shame, especially around sex and childbirth. Fact 83. Illegitimacy carried a stigma that punished children for adult judgment. The setting is a society obsessed with family legitimacy. The setup is moral order. Marriage is the proper structure and children should be born within it. But the pivot is who paid the price. Children labelled illegitimate could face discrimination in relief systems, inheritance, education, and community status. Mothers could be shamed, excluded, economically trapped. Fathers were often harder to hold accountable, and social judgment frequently fell hardest on women and children because they were visible. This is documented in poor law administration and the culture of social stigma reflected in records and writing of the era. The consequence is a blunt moral failure. Society built a category of human beings it treated as lesser from birth, as if a child could be guilty of the circumstances of their arrival. And speaking of moral failure, Britain built whole institutions around reform that sometimes functioned like moral prisons. Fact 84. Magdalen and rescue homes could protect some women and imprison others. The setting is the world of fallen women institutions, homes meant to rescue women from prostitution, pregnancy outside marriage, or perceived immorality. The setup is salvation. Give women shelter, training, moral guidance, and a new start. But the pivot is control. Some homes offered genuine refuge, others imposed strict confinement, harsh routines, and limited freedom, sometimes keeping women longer than they wished. Admission could be voluntary in theory and coercive in practice, because the alternative was often homelessness, workhouse, or social ruin. Evidence exists in institutional records, scandals when abuse surfaced, and the long debate about whether rescue can remain rescue when it removes autonomy. The consequence is a truth Britain often avoided. Moral reform can become moral domination when it treats people as objects to be corrected. Meanwhile, the law had its own way of correcting women by defining them as problems to be medically managed. Fact 85. Women could be pathologized for emotions that men were allowed to call temper. The setting is Victorian medical culture, where gender assumptions are treated as science. The setup is diagnosis. Doctors label conditions, treat illness, and explain behavior. But the pivot is bias. Women's anger, grief, sexuality, and distress could be framed as hysteria, nervous weakness, instability, medicalized in ways that stripped authority from their voices. Men's anger could be strength or character. Women's anger could be illness. And once an emotion is treated as pathology, it becomes easier to dismiss the cause of the emotion. This is documented in medical writings, asylum admissions, and the broader gender culture of the period. The consequence is an erasure mechanism. Legitimate suffering can be treated as symptom rather than message. And speaking of messages, Britain's press loved scandals, but it also loved shaping public fear. Fact 86. Newspapers could turn crime into entertainment and fear into a business. The setting is the expanding popular press, where literacy rises and newspapers become daily consumption. The setup is information. Journalism keeps the public informed. But the pivot is sensationalism. Crime reporting could be lurid, repetitive, and moralistic, building narratives of dangerous classes, monstrous criminals, and moral decay. Sometimes this exposed genuine injustice. Sometimes it amplified fear, justified harsh policing, and treated poor neighborhoods as theaters of vice. This is documented in media history and the tone of period journalism itself. The consequence is cultural. Public anxiety becomes a product, and policy can follow the shape of fear rather than evidence. And speaking of evidence, Britain loved scientific certainty, but sometimes it used it to justify cruelty in plain sight. Fact 87. Eugenics found a home in respectable spaces, not just fringe corners. The setting is late 19th and early 20th century Britain, where debates about heredity, degeneration, and social fitness circulate in educated circles. The setup is concern for public health and national strength, but the pivot is the moral horror behind the logic. Eugenic ideas argued that poverty, disability, and criminality were hereditary problems to be managed through selective breeding, segregation, or restrictions. The appeal was simple and seductive. Instead of fixing social conditions, blame biology. Instead of funding welfare, control reproduction. These ideas were debated openly in various forums, sometimes adopted in softened policy forms, sometimes challenged by critics who saw the ethical abyss. The consequence is that modernity can produce new cruelties, not by accident, but by rationalization. When prejudice is given a laboratory coat, it becomes harder for the public to recognize it as prejudice. And speaking of recognition, Britain also developed an obsession with types of faces, bodies, and neighborhoods, as if poverty could be read like weather. Fact 88. The poor were studied like a species, which made it easier to treat them as a problem to manage. The setting is social investigation and early sociology, where reformers, journalists, and officials document the lives of the poor. The setup can be sympathetic. People want to understand hardship and propose solutions, but the pivot is tone and power. Some investigators wrote with genuine compassion. Others wrote as if the poor were a separate race with distinct habits, moral failings, and predictable behaviors. Class became biology in the public imagination, and once it does, the next step is easy. Containment instead of equality. Evidence comes from the language of social surveys and the policy debates they fed. The consequence is cultural permission. If poverty is a type, then harsh policy feels like management, not injustice. Meanwhile, Britain was also learning to manage the poor through a deceptively simple tool: time. Fact 89. Poverty meant living on a clock you didn't control. The setting is industrial time discipline, factory whistles, strict shifts, rail timetables, workhouse routines. The setup is efficiency. Coordinated time makes modern life possible. But the pivot is how time becomes a form of domination. If you are wealthy, time can be flexible. You can move appointments, travel comfortably, recover from illness, take rest. If you are poor, lateness can cost wages, jobs, or lodging. Workhouse schedules could strip autonomy. Even the search for work could become a time trap, consuming hours with no guarantee of reward. This is documented in labour history and the lived rhythms of industrial society. The consequence is exhaustion as policy. When survival requires constant punctuality under threat, the poor become tired in a way the comfortable rarely understand. And speaking of understanding, Britain often framed its own cruelty as common sense, especially in colonial context. Fact 90. Common sense was sometimes the language used to explain away violence in empire. The setting is imperial governance, where British officials justify policies with calm, administrative language. The setup is pragmatism. Decisions are made for stability, order, and the greater good. But the pivot is what stability often required: tax demands, forced labour in some contexts, punitive expeditions, collective punishments, land restructuring. Empire could rely on coercion while framing it as reasonable necessity. The administrative style made violence feel distant. It turned suffering into an unfortunate outcome of policy rather than a moral decision. This pattern is visible in colonial correspondence, official reports, and the debates that erupted when scandals broke through the surface. The consequence is a chilling lesson. Cruelty becomes easier when it can be written in passive voice. Meanwhile, at home, Britain wrote cruelty in a different voice, sometimes literally in the voice of common law tradition, which often protected the powerful by default. Fact 91. Tradition could function like a shield. If something was old enough, it was treated as right enough. The setting is Britain's proud legal and constitutional culture. The setup is continuity. Tradition provides stability and identity, but the pivot is what tradition can hide. If a system is unjust but ancient, it can become invisible. People stop questioning it. They begin to treat it as natural law rather than human choice. Property arrangements, class privileges, gender roles, many were defended not with evidence but with age. This is how it has always been. Historical debates show reformers repeatedly had to argue against the weight of habit. The consequence is that injustice can become comfortable when it is familiar, and Britain was often extremely comfortable. And speaking of comfort, Britain's comfort depended on global supply chains long before the term existed. Fact 92. Britain's everyday life was built on global extraction, and people learned not to look too closely. The setting is tea, sugar, cotton, tobacco, spices, rubber. ordinary goods in British households that were anything but ordinary in their origin. The setup is consumer comfort. These are just products, part of modern life. But the pivot is the hidden labour and violence behind them. Plantations, coerced labour systems, land seizures and trade monopolies shaped the availability and price of goods. Even after legal reforms ended certain forms of overt exploitation, economic power imbalances remained. The empire made global inequality feel like domestic normality. This is documented in economic history and the records of trade and colonial governance. The consequence is moral distance. When suffering is far away, it becomes easier to ignore. Britain didn't just rule territory, it ruled attention. And speaking of attention, when attention turned inward, it often landed on the poor as a convenient scapegoat for broader instability. Fact 93. In times of crisis, the poor were often blamed for the conditions that crushed them. The setting is economic downturns, food price spikes, unemployment waves, and social unrest. The setup is fear. Society wants a reason why things feel unstable. But the pivot is the target selection. It's politically easier to blame idleness, vice, and bad character than to confront wage structures, land policy, industrial cycles, or government failure. So moral narratives intensify during hardship. The poor become the explanation for poverty, and the state can respond with policing and punishment rather than structural reform. This pattern appears in political speeches, newspapers, and the shifting tone of charity and poor law enforcement. The consequence is that crisis becomes a mirror that reveals a society's priorities. Britain often chose order over justice, and speaking of justice, Britain's legal reforms often arrived only after scandal forced the nation to feel shame publicly. Fact 94. Reform often required public outrage, which meant suffering had to become entertainment first. The setting is the rhythm of reform, exposés, inquiries, parliamentary debate, gradual change. The setup is the national self-image. Britain reforms itself through reason and humanity. But the pivot is what triggers reform. Often, harm could continue for years, quietly, until something made it visible. A scandal, a shocking report, a famous case, a public campaign. Once the story became emotionally unavoidable, reform became possible. Not because leaders suddenly discovered morality, but because the cost of ignoring it rose. This pattern is documented across workhouse scandals, factory reform, public health crises, and institutional abuse revelations. The consequence is bitter. Progress may happen, but it can require suffering to become spectacle first. And speaking of spectacle, Britain's national rituals sometimes distracted from everyday brutality by offering a grand story of unity. Fact 95. Monarchy and ritual helped sell stability even when society was unstable. The setting is coronations, jubilees, royal funerals, public ceremonies, moments when Britain performs itself. The setup is unity. The nation gathers, history feels continuous, identity feels shared. But the pivot is what ritual can do politically. Ritual provides emotional glue. It turns hierarchy into theatre and makes inequality feel like tradition rather than choice. It can calm unrest by giving people a sense of belonging to a larger story, even when their personal story is harsh. That doesn't mean ritual is inherently evil. It means it's powerful. Historical accounts show how monarchy was used, and used itself, to present continuity during periods of upheaval. Industrialization, reform movements, imperial tension, war. The consequence is subtle. When people are emotionally invested in a symbol, they may tolerate more structural cruelty underneath it. And speaking of structural cruelty, Britain's greatest talent may have been making harsh systems feel normal. Fact 96. Britain excelled at making cruelty boring. The setting is everyday administration, relief rules, policing routines, court procedures, institutional schedules. The setup is order. Society runs smoothly. Systems function, bureaucracy hums. But the pivot is what smoothness can conceal. If the cruelty is predictable, it becomes background. If the punishments are legal, they appear legitimate. If the suffering is processed quietly, the comfortable don't have to confront it. Britain often didn't need dramatic brutality because it had something more efficient: routine. Evidence for this is not one document, but the way multiple systems aligned: poor law, labour markets, policing, housing, gender norms, to keep the vulnerable contained. The consequence is the hardest truth to teach in school. Injustice can be ordinary, and ordinary is the most dangerous form because it doesn't look like a villain. And speaking of villains, history often reduces cruelty to a few bad individuals so the system can keep its clean self-image. Fact 97. The bad apple story is a comforting lie that protects the barrel. The setting is scandal after scandal: abusive workhouse masters, brutal policemen, cruel factory owners, corrupt officials. The setup is the relief. It was just one monster. We've removed him, but the pivot is structural. These individuals thrived because systems allowed it, rewarded it, or ignored it. When oversight is weak, when victims have no voice, when institutions protect reputation, abuse becomes not an anomaly, but a risk built into the design. Removing one person can be necessary, but it can also be a performance of accountability that leaves the mechanisms untouched. This is visible in the cycle of outrage, inquiry, scapegoat, and slow reform. The consequence is that Britain often addressed cruelty as a character flaw rather than a policy choice. And speaking of policy choices, some of Britain's most consequential choices were made in the name of economy, as if money were a natural law. Fact 98. Economy was often used as a moral justification. If it saved money, it was treated as responsible. The setting is local councils, poor law boards, imperial administrations, parliamentary committees, all arguing about budgets. The setup is responsibility. We must be careful with public funds. But the pivot is whose suffering counted as a cost. Saving money on relief meant hunger. Saving money on housing meant disease. Saving money on oversight meant abuse. The language of economy could make cruelty sound virtuous. And when the people harmed were politically weak, the savings could be celebrated as efficiency. Records of policy debate show how often economy was invoked as a trump card. The consequence is that financial prudence became a moral shield. Britain learned to call neglect responsible governance. And speaking of responsibility, history education itself is a choice, and what gets left out is often what a society cannot bear to admit about itself. Fact 99. What you weren't taught is often the most honest part of the story. The setting is the classroom and the national narrative. The setup is the official version: kings and queens, wars and treaties, inventions and reforms, Britain as a steady march of progress. But the pivot is the silence. The stories that make Britain look harsh, hypocritical, or structurally cruel are often softened, compressed, or omitted. Not always because of conspiracy, sometimes because teachers have limited time, sometimes because national myths are emotionally comforting, sometimes because the archive of the poor is harder to teach than the archive of the powerful. But the omission has a consequence. It leaves people with a story of Britain that feels like a museum: clean, curated, safe. Real history is not safe. Real history is what happens when systems meet bodies. And speaking of bodies, here is the last rare fact, and it might be the most useful one of all. Fact 100. British history isn't really about Britain. It's about how power hides and how it can be found. The setting is everything we've walked through: streets, workhouses, ships, factories, courts, colonies, homes. The setup is a nation that tells itself it is reasonable, restrained, orderly. But the pivot is the mechanism beneath the personality. Power hides in rules, in definitions, in paperwork, in who gets believed, in whose suffering becomes a scandal and whose suffering stays invisible. British history is full of dramatic moments, yes, but the truly rare facts often live in the dull details, the administrative language, the everyday routines that decide who is protected and who is processed. We know this because the evidence is everywhere once you look for it. in laws, reports, letters, debates, newspapers, and the physical landscapes shaped by those decisions. The consequence is a kind of permission. If power can hide in ordinary systems, then it can also be challenged there, by changing rules, by demanding accountability, by refusing the comfort of myths. That's the uncomfortable truth Britain kept relearning, and it's the truth you almost never get taught in school. So when people talk about British history as a parade of monarchs and battles, remember what we actually saw tonight. We saw a country that could be brilliantly inventive and quietly ruthless at the same time. A nation that built sewers and railways, and also built workhouses designed to feel worse than hunger. A culture that celebrated respectability while using it like a weapon, turning poverty into a public trial where the sentence was shame. A state that could speak the language of liberty while keeping speech elastic enough to punish whoever became inconvenient. An empire that could present itself as civilization while rearranging economies, labour, and survival far from home, and then returning to Britain with wealth clean enough to fund museums, estates, and polite confidence. And none of this is meant to flatten the past into a single accusation. People fought back, reformers shouted until they were heard, communities built mutual aid when the state refused, workers organized, women campaigned, journalists exposed, and ordinary people endured with stubbornness that never makes it into a textbook timeline. But the rare fact, the ones that stick under your nails, are the mechanism, the way harm was made routine, the way cruelty was administered through forms and rules and common sense, the way the nation learned to move suffering out of sight and call that progress. If you're listening in the dark, half asleep, let that be the final thought. History isn't only the dramatic event, it's the system that made the event possible. It's the quiet decision repeated thousands of times until it becomes normal. And once you learn to see that, once you can hear the machinery behind the story, you start spotting it everywhere, not just in old Britain, but in any society that tells you it's reasonable while asking you not to look too closely. You don't have to carry outrage into your dreams, just carry clarity. The past isn't finished with us. We're still living inside some of its habits, and the first step out is always the same, seeing what was hidden and naming it plainly.